July of 1944. The war in Europe is still raging. The trains that rumble into the heart of Texas carry something no local has ever seen before. Young German women in uniform, guarded by American soldiers, with sunburnt faces and quiet eyes. Among them is 19-year-old Liesl Weber. She's been told many things about Americans, that they're brutal, uncultured, and cruel to prisoners. She expects to be spat on, humiliated, maybe even worse. But as she steps down from the rail car into the sweltering Texas heat, something strange happens. A man with a Stetson hat and a thick southern drawl offers her a cold drink. His smile is kind, not mocking. Another hands her a lemon-scented handkerchief, as if she's a guest, not an enemy. She's stunned. The land smells like hay and dust. The guards aren't yelling, and the locals, they're waving. Liesl clutches her canvas bag tighter. She thought she was walking into a nightmare. But standing there, boots on dry earth, she begins to realize this isn't the America she was warned about. And she's not the only one about to fall in love with her captors. The propaganda they believed. Before she ever saw Texas, Liesl had been taught to fear it. In the final years of Nazi Germany, the regime's grip on information was absolute. Newsreels showed Americans as monsters, soldiers who danced on corpses, bombed children, and lived in cities ruled by chaos, Jews, and Negroes. In classrooms, teachers whispered warnings. If the Allies capture you, they will shoot you or worse, especially if you're a woman. Liesl grew up in Berlin, raised on ration cards and air raid sirens. By 17, she'd already lost 2 brothers on the Eastern Front. She volunteered as a Luftwaffe auxiliary, hoping to serve, maybe help wounded soldiers. Instead, she was captured by the Americans while stationed near a munitions site in France, just weeks after D-Day. The rumors started early, aboard the transport ship across the Atlantic. The women were packed below deck, seasick and silent. Someone claimed a French girl had been assaulted by American guards. Another whispered about prisoners thrown overboard. There was no proof, but fear doesn't need facts. It needs repetition. By the time they reached port in the United States, most of the women had rehearsed a silent vow. Obey, avoid eye contact, survive. But nothing they saw matched what they'd been told. The train to Texas rolled past cornfields and quiet towns, past signs in English they couldn't read, past people who looked normal. Families waved from porches. Children ran beside the train, laughing. An old man tipped his hat. One girl cried quietly in her seat. "Why are they smiling?" she asked. There was no answer. They arrived at Camp Hearn, one of several POW camps built across the American South. Designed to house thousands of prisoners, most of them German men, it now made room for a small group of female auxiliaries. These weren't hardened SS guards or concentration camp staff. Most were clerks, nurses, and telephone operators assigned to non-combat roles. But they wore the uniform of the enemy. At the gate, a sign read, "Geneva Convention observed here." That alone felt like a trick. The guards were young Americans, many not much older than the women themselves. They were quiet, almost shy. They didn't leer. They didn't scream. One even helped a girl carry her suitcase. Inside the camp, the shock deepened. There was a library with real books, an art studio with paint, a small choir rehearsing near the chapel. The barracks were plain but clean. There were rules, yes, and fences with barbed wire. But there were no dogs, no beatings, no insults, just order and decency. Liesl stared at the bulletin board near the mess hall. A schedule was pinned up in English and German. It listed work assignments, chapel times, even movie nights. American movies. Someone muttered, "This can't be real." It felt like some kind of psychological trick, to break them with kindness, to make them lower their guard. But day after day, the pattern didn't change. The food was strange but plentiful. Eggs, sausages, even pie. The guards greeted them each morning with a nod, sometimes even a Guten Morgen. No one touched them without permission. The women began to relax just slightly. They spoke more freely, wrote letters home, and even laughed again. One afternoon, Liesel stood near the fence and watched a group of young Americans play horseshoes under the sun. The sound of country music drifted from a nearby radio. She turned to her friend and said, almost guiltily, "This doesn't feel like prison." Her friend didn't answer, just smiled, brushing dust from her skirt. But under the surface, a deeper transformation was beginning. The enemy was becoming human. And in the towns just outside the fences, a quiet curiosity was growing. Locals had heard the Germans were here, real, live Nazis, shipped into their backyard. Some expected monsters. What they saw were girls, barely out of school, tired and unsure, trying to stay dignified in a land they didn't understand. Soon the real story would begin, not of war, but of hearts opened and minds changed. And for some, of a love they never expected. Arrival in Texas, a culture shock. Camp Hearn was a strange contradiction. On the outside, it was ringed with barbed wire and watchtowers. But inside, it looked more like a sleepy college campus than a wartime prison. There were red gravel paths, tall pine trees, and neatly painted buildings. The air smelled of sweat and wood smoke, not fear. For women like Liesel, the contrast was dizzying. Each morning, the camp woke not to screaming or boots, but to birds and bells. The guards, mostly young, bored GIs from Texas, Oklahoma, or Arkansas, treated the prisoners with a kind of distant politeness. They followed orders, but they weren't cruel. Some even went out of their way to make life more bearable. Liesel's bunkmate, Helga, was shocked when a guard gave her extra soap. "What's the catch?" she asked. There wasn't one. The rules were clear. No one could leave the camp without escort. No fraternization with the guards. English was encouraged, German allowed. No political organizing. But inside those boundaries, life was surprisingly livable. There were jobs to do, cooking, laundry, maintaining the grounds. But there were also clubs. The women formed a sewing circle. Some volunteered in the camp garden. Others took English classes, eager to decode the strange new world outside the fence. One woman, Inga, was a pianist before the war. She found an upright piano in the chapel and began to play each evening. At first, it was old German folk songs. Then, after hearing a jazz broadcast on the radio, she tried a Gershwin tune. Within days, American guards were standing outside the chapel, listening quietly. Nobody said it out loud, but something was happening. The distance between enemy and person was shrinking. Still, the world outside the camp remained a mystery. The nearest town, Hearn, was a dusty Texas dot on the map. Its population had never seen German soldiers, especially not female ones. Rumors spread quickly that the prisoners were dangerous, or fanatical, or perhaps even witches. But curiosity was stronger than fear. Sometimes, local farmers would drive past the camp slowly, hoping to catch a glimpse. Children dared each other to sneak up to the fence. One Sunday afternoon, a teenage boy tossed a baseball over the wire on purpose, then asked, in broken German, if someone would throw it back. A girl named Marta did, smiling. The boy waved. She waved back. That was the entire exchange. But for Marta, it meant something. For the first time since capture, she didn't feel like a criminal. Then came the harvest season. By late summer of 1944, American farms were desperate for labor. Most able-bodied men were off fighting in Europe or the Pacific. The War Department approved a new program. Allow carefully screened prisoners, including women, to work under supervision on local farms and ranches. It would help the economy and keep the POWs active. The risk was considered low. And so, just weeks after their arrival, German women in uniform began stepping through the gates, not as fugitives, but as farmhands. For the first time, they saw the real America. They rode in pickup trucks through endless fields of cotton and corn. They walked into barns where radio music played through static and horses nickered in the dark. They met ranchers and widows, housewives and teenagers. They were watched closely, yes. But they were also talked to, occasionally teased, and, more often than not, treated with something they had never expected: kindness. Liesel was assigned to a dairy farm run by an older couple named Tom and Ruth. They didn't ask her about the war. They asked if she wanted lemonade. When she made a mistake milking the cows, Ruth laughed and said, "Honey, you'll get it next time." It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it wasn't hatred either. On the way back to camp that evening, Liesel looked out the truck window. The sunset turned the Texas sky into fire. Somewhere behind her, the war still raged. But out here, in this wide, strange, generous land, something inside her had shifted. She was still a prisoner, but she no longer felt like the enemy. Love in the time of barbed wire. At first, it was just a glance, a sideways look from the back of a truck, a nod across a dusty field, a quiet hello from a young American man driving a tractor. The Geneva Convention said nothing about chemistry. The women were supposed to be watched at all times. But the realities of rural Texas made that difficult. Fields stretched for miles. Supervisors were often busy or simply indifferent. And in the open air, far from the war rooms of Berlin or Washington, human nature took over. Marta was the first to admit she'd fallen. Her letters home, heavily censored, hinted at someone named Jay, a local farm hand who sang while he worked and brought her wildflowers when no one was looking. She didn't know his politics. She didn't care. He made her laugh, and for the first time in years, she felt young. Liesel, too, began noticing things. John, the rancher's son, was quiet and strong, with hands that told of hard work and a voice that held none of the arrogance she expected from Americans. He didn't speak German. She barely spoke English. But they found a rhythm. She helped with the horses. He showed her how to mend a fence. He let her ride, just once, when his mother wasn't looking. He never called her Kraut. She never told him she once prayed for a Nazi victory. It was a slow unraveling of suspicion. The myths they'd been told about cruelty, corruption, and inhumanity fell apart with every shared task, every shy smile. They began to see each other not as enemies, but as people caught in a storm neither of them had started. But not everyone approved. Some local families were outraged. "Our boys are dying overseas," they said, "and these girls are having picnics with the enemy?" A Baptist preacher delivered a fiery sermon about the seduction of Christian men by foreign women who once served Hitler. One farmer reported his neighbor for harboring Germans in his barn. The army issued a quiet warning: fraternization is discouraged. But enforcement was lax. Why? Because the war was winding down, and everyone, even the guards, was tired. Tired of death, tired of fear, tired of pretending the world made sense. So, the rules blurred. At night, when the guards relaxed and the air cooled, something remarkable happened. In barns and fields, in secret groves just beyond the perimeter, dances were held. Not official, not sanctioned, but very real. Someone would sneak in a radio. Someone else would bring Coca-Cola or cigarettes. And under the stars, American farm boys and German prisoner girls swayed to Glenn Miller and swing. They didn't talk politics. They didn't talk war. They talked about movies, about food, about where they were before the world broke apart. One woman, Greta, later wrote in her memoir, I remember dancing in bare feet on the dirt floor of an old shed, my hair unbraided, his hands careful but sure. For 10 minutes, I forgot I was a prisoner. I remembered I was a girl. Some of the guards looked the other way. Others quietly guarded the events from a distance, not to stop them, but to protect them. Because somehow, everyone understood, this was healing. Even in war, there are cracks where light gets in. By early 1945, at least a dozen women in Camp Hearn were believed to be romantically involved with locals, either farmers, guards, or townsfolk. Rumors swirled, but few were punished. One woman was transferred after being caught kissing an American soldier behind the supply shed. Another was quietly reassigned to indoor duties when a rancher's wife accused her of seducing her son. But most were left alone. These were not grand affairs. They were small, fragile things, built on stolen time and forbidden glances, and yet they endured. Because when everything else had been taken, their homes, their nations, their futures, these women still had hearts. And somehow, miraculously, those hearts found others willing to hold them. The war ends and hearts break. On May 8, 1945, the world changed. Word spread through the camp like a summer fire. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. For the women at Camp Hearn, it was a moment of silence more than celebration. No cheering, no tears, just stillness. Some stood frozen in their work clothes, unsure what came next. They had dreamed of peace, but not like this. Not as prisoners, not in a country they'd once called monstrous. Not with letters from home that arrived fewer and fewer, some never arriving at all. Within days, the War Department issued instructions. All prisoners would be processed for repatriation. For the women, it meant returning to a country in ruins, turned and were never heard from again. Others married but divorced within years, unable to bridge the gap between two worlds. But for those who made it, who stayed, something deeper remained. They weren't just survivors. They were proof that even after the bloodiest war in human history, love could still win. From enemy to Texan. They were no longer prisoners, but they would never fully be Americans either. At least, not on paper. Yet in spirit. In the quiet routines of rural life. In the pies baked and babies raised. In the songs hummed while folding laundry on back porches. They became something else entirely. Texans. Liesl and John built a small home on the edge of his father's ranch. It had 2 rooms, a wood stove, and a front porch with a swing. Liesl planted sunflowers, though they didn't take at first. The soil was too dry. She learned to mend jeans instead of uniforms. Her accent never faded, but her neighbors did. At first, people were cautious. The war was still fresh. Newspapers ran stories of Nuremberg. The word German still drew side eyes. At church, some sat a row away. One woman crossed the street when Liesl came into town. But time is persistent. It erodes even the hardest stone. Liesl started helping at the local schoolhouse. She taught children how to say their names in German, how to sing O Tannenbaum. She knitted blankets for church raffles. She baked strudels for county fairs. And slowly, people stopped seeing her as that German girl. She became Miss Liesl, then Mrs. Miller, then simply one of their own. She wasn't alone. Another former prisoner, Greta, opened a small cafe in Austin with her American husband. The walls were painted sky blue, and the menu had schnitzel next to chili. Her daughter spoke English with a Texas twang and learned to say grace before dinner, a custom Greta had once found strange, even childlike. One woman, Annalise, married a widowed preacher and became a Sunday school teacher. Another became a nurse, caring for the same types of veterans who once guarded her. The irony was never lost on them. "I was trained to fear these people," one woman said. Now they trust me with their children. Not everyone's journey was easy. Some marriages buckled under pressure. A few women left, quietly, returning to a new West Germany that barely remembered them. But most stayed. Not out of necessity, but out of conviction. They had chosen this place, this life. Cities bombed to ash. Families scattered. Ideologies dead. For Liesel, it meant leaving John. They sat under the cotton tree one last time, the same place they had first spoken without words. She had learned to say, "I don't want to go," and he had learned enough to reply, "I know." There was no marriage license, no paperwork, just promises. "I'll find a way," he said. She didn't believe him, not because he was lying, but because the world had always found a way to break what they'd built. At the train station, dozens of women stood with canvas bags and folded uniforms. Some held hands with Americans. Others just stared at the platform. No one spoke much. When the whistle blew, Liesel looked back. John was still there, hat in hand, eyes full of something she couldn't name. Not sorrow, not hope. Something in between. The train pulled away. Back in Germany, the welcome was cold. The women were treated with suspicion, some even with contempt. "You surrendered too easily," one official said. Others were labeled traitors for having worked in soft posts. Some towns refused to acknowledge them. Jobs were scarce. Food, scarcer. But Liesel carried something with her no one could confiscate. A photograph of a ranch. And a name. John Miller. She wrote a letter. Months passed. Then an answer came. He had been trying too. There was a new program, she learned, called the War Bride Act. Though originally intended for women who married American GIs in Europe, a loophole allowed former prisoners, under very specific conditions, to return and marry American citizens. It took petitions, letters, affidavits from the rancher's family. But in the spring of 1946, Liesel boarded another ship. This time, not as a prisoner, but as a fiancée. She arrived in New York wearing a borrowed coat and holding a slip of paper with John's address. In Texas, he was waiting at the station. He wore the same hat. He didn't say anything. He just held her. They were married that summer, and they were not alone. Across the country, in quiet corners of states like Texas, Georgia, and Iowa, dozens of German women returned, not as repatriates, but as wives. Some had met their husbands through farm work, others through church programs, others, like Liesel, through luck and impossible persistence. By 1950, over 200 former German POWs, male and female, had legally immigrated back to the U.S., sponsored by Americans who had once been their jailers, employers, or lovers. In Herne, neighbors whispered, but most eventually accepted. After all, she worked hard. She smiled often. She baked better bread than anyone in town. John never talked much about how they met. He just said she was a gift from a war that took too much. Not every story ended so sweetly. Some women these people. By the 1960s, their children were joining the U.S. Army, playing football in American high schools, marching in 4th of July parades. One of Liesel's sons would serve in Vietnam. Another became a teacher. She kept a small box under her bed, with her old uniform neatly folded, a pressed flower from the day she met John, and the train ticket from her repatriation in 1945. She never spoke bitterly about Germany, but when asked if she missed it, she'd smile and say, "No one offers you lemonade on a train in Berlin." Over time, the town forgot the details, which farm, which guard, which camp, but they remembered the feeling that somehow, despite everything, something beautiful had grown from the wreckage. Decades later, when John passed away, the funeral was packed. Liesel sat in the front row, hands folded. A local pastor, who hadn't even been born when the war ended, gave the eulogy. He mentioned her only once. And by his side, through every trial and triumph, was Liesel, A woman who taught us that grace can come from the most unexpected places. That night, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Liesl sat alone on the porch swing, sipping tea. The cicadas buzzed. The land was quiet. She looked out over the field, the same one where she once picked cotton, once fell in love, once learned to ride. And she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. They said I came here as a prisoner, but I was set free. And a final letter. Time, as always, did what war could not. It softened edges. It blurred uniforms. It carried old soldiers and young lovers into silence. Liesl Miller lived a long life. She outlived her husband, her siblings, even some of her own children. But she never left Texas. She never stopped baking rye bread on Sundays. Never stopped hanging laundry in the dry breeze or humming lullabies that drifted across the porch like ghosts from another world. She rarely spoke of the war. Not because she had something to hide, but because the war, to her, had already taken enough. But near the end of her life, when her granddaughter Anna asked where she was really from, Liesl handed her a letter. It was dated July 3rd, 1995. She wrote, "You ask me why I never went back. I did, in dreams, in letters, in the sound of trains. But I left Berlin as a girl trained to fear what she didn't understand. I arrived in Texas still wearing that fear like a coat. But America made me take it off. Not all at once, but in pieces. With every act of kindness, every bowl of stew, every time someone handed me a glass of lemonade instead of a rifle. I found my peace here, not because it was easy, but because it was human. They made me believe the enemy had no heart. But this place taught me the truth. The enemy smiles, too." Liesl died later that year. At her funeral, 3 former guards from Camp Hearn came to pay their respects. So did neighbors, old church friends, and a few locals who remembered the rumors about her past. Though by then, those whispers had faded into legend. Her gravestone reads, "Born in Berlin, died in Brenham, loved both." Somewhere, in the back of a dusty photo album, there's a snapshot from 1946. A German girl in a plain cotton dress, standing beside a tall man in a cowboy hat. They're smiling, not posing, just smiling. She came to America in chains. She stayed because of love. And in doing so, she rewrote what it meant to be an enemy. Not with speeches or revolutions, but with the quiet power of choosing to stay when every voice told her to leave. Because sometimes history doesn't end with a treaty. Sometimes it ends with a wedding ring. The story of German POWs in America is one of the least expected chapters of World War II. It didn't involve tanks or bombings or battlefield heroism. It involved dinner tables, front porches, and broken people finding wholeness in a country they once feared. In total, over 400,000 German prisoners were held in the United States during the war. While the vast majority were men, a few hundred women, auxiliaries, nurses, clerks, shared their fate. Most returned home, but a few stayed behind. Not because they were forced to, but because they fell in love, not just with people, but with an idea. The idea that your enemy can become your neighbor. And that forgiveness, though slow, is possible.